Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma 231 here, back in day talking about Kagurabachi, chapter number 69. This chapter is titled, The Guy with the Scar. And man, I wonder who that guy with what sort of scar is. I mean, what prominent Kagurabachi character do we have with a massive scar going down the the left side of his face? I mean, I really wonder what character this could be. Oh wait, it's Ikura, because Ikura gets brought up in this chapter, and honestly, I am really happy the way this chapter went and played out, because, of course, I read this chapter, like, what is it now? 5 days ago when it initially released, and I sort of sat down and read it. I was actually on my college town's bus system because I was, like, coming back from home, getting back up to my college campus, and I was sitting on the bus. I'm like, oh, wait, Shonen Jump came out today. I haven't read any of the chapters yet, and I was like, hey, I also have not been on... Well, I also haven't seen any spoilers for the Kagurabachi chapter. What is going on in this chapter? And I sort of sit down and I start to read it, and I'm like, okay, this is a little interesting. I mean, we see the Mosmi get up doing all of their sort of stuff, and I'm just like, oh, wait, Ikura's here. We're bringing up Ikura again. And then as we just progress through this chapter, just like keeps ratcheting up on like the level of coolness, and like the more I like Ikura, the more we're seeing of him, until we eventually get all the way to the end of the chapter where, like, the big, massive thing happens in this chapter. Of course, we will be getting into that whenever we start to fully talk about the chapter, and honestly, I really do just want to jump into this chapter because it's just so much fun and so awesome. So, before we got talking about chapter number 69 of Kagurabachi, haha, it's a funny number, I can't believe I haven't made one of those jokes yet, and as I mentioned last time, I still really don't understand where that joke comes from. I just know that it's decently funny, so, yeah, I don't even know why it's decently funny. It's just been, like, so ingrained, like, yes, you're supposed to laugh at that number, but, hey, is what it is. Before we hop into this chapter, we need to talk about what happened last time in Kagurabachi. And last time we had this very interesting chapter where Chihiro and Hirohiko really faced off, and it was really about the battle between the two of them. Of course, we know that General Manager Yokoro Sengoku had ended up dead, and we also saw one of his disciples who pretty much was very upset that Hirohiko as a person is a complete genius when it comes to the sword. They do not train, they don't do all of that. They don't even have a master being that they are just a student of freedom. And that was really one of the big deals of last chapter, was meeting this guy who was very upset about all of the various stuff going on here. And eventually the end of the chapter was Iori pretty much going like, hey, whenever we get up there and I get to go back to my old life, like, am I the only one who feels that they still have a hole in their heart? And that was the really deep emotional ties that we ended off last chapter of Kagurabachi on. And really, we don't jump back on into that exact same scene, but we pretty much follow the same linear structure of it, right? As we open this chapter, we see that both Ro and Iori ended up making it to the 35th floor, or the rooftop of the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel, as I very easily found out in the editing of last video, because I was going back and reread a few of these Kagurabachi chapters, and I'm like, wait a second. Like, we clearly learn in chapter 66, like, hey, 35 floors is how tall the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel is. And, like, I don't know why I was just, like, not rashly thinking through all of that whenever I recorded my last review, which was, honestly, like, almost 2 weeks ago at the recording of this review, which is a little crazy to think about, but hey, it is what it is. Like I said, we open up this chapter with Ro and Iori making it up to the top floor, the rooftop of the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel, as we pretty much see that Moku's like, oh, you guys are up here, right? And we even see that Ro's like, hey, it's so cold up here, like, can't we, like, turn on the heat or something? Or like, no, we're outside. And Moku's like, hey, where's Chihiro and all of this? And Ro pretty much explains, like, hey, he went downstairs for the key, and also that the general manager got taken out. And we see that both Moku and Sumi are like, oh, what? Did Sengoku actually got, like, taken out? I thought his Reagan One Sword style was, like, the biggest deal ever, right? But Ro's just like, hey, as he sort of turns over to where Iori is standing, we see that Iori has this, like, very painful expression on her face. Ro's just like, hey, we'll implement the seal as soon as the key is up here, and then we'll send you back to your old regular life, Iori. And Iori is very reserved in hearing all of this, like, she's not really feeling the best, especially after her whole realization of, like, I feel like I'm really missing something here. And Iori just thinks to herself, like, hey, which me will I be? My father isn't looking for me. And she's like, hey, I'll go back to school then. It's just completely fine. And we also remember some of Hirohiko's words last time, like, hey, Summer's currently in motion to kill all of the contracted sword bearers. And Iori's just thinking, like, hey, I want to go back to school. I want to go back to that reality. But all of those bad guys came because I tried to break the seal. And she remembers Rose saying like, hey, once we finish this one, there's going to be no risk of you breaking the seal whatsoever. And we also sort of get Rose's perspective as we see that he's just looking at Iori and just like also rationalizing all of this, just thinking like, hey, I know that doesn't sound very convincing that this will be a perfect seal this time, being that we messed up so bad last time, right? As he just thinks like, hey, and if anyone slipped up, it's Demosme. Remember his words from a few chapters ago. As Iori just is like, hey, I mean, it's really not about who's to blame. I mean, really, if it weren't for me, none of this. As we see the elevator behind Iori and Ro dings, as we see it, the door starts to open, and out of the elevator comes none other than Kogiri. As we see his sort of like little bit of a slender form pops out, he doesn't even say anything to this entire montage. As we see that Ro sort of notices like, oh crap, Kogiri's here. As he goes and he parries blades with Kogiri, and the two of them start to go back and forth, of course. And Sumi and Moku both sort of like teleport down, almost like using their ninja skills to like almost appear right next to Iori to pretty much get her to safety in a moment. And Moku's like, all right, you guys get back. And he's like, hey, Sumi, you take care of Iori. As we see that he sees a few other sorcerers have now appeared on the roof of the building. As we see that Ro gets ready and just goes through and he starts slashing. As we see, he just grabs out his sword, just keeps going back and forth. So he just thinks like, whoa, these guys are completely unhinged. Even with fatal wounds, they still keep charging. And like, man, it's like all those people at the Senkutsuji temple. Like, have they been brainwashed? Like, is this Hishaku sorcery or something? As he just thinks like, okay, well, hey, individually, they're all weaker this time, which leads to me to believe that they're not using all of the Danseki material. Also, we know there's like a finite amount of that sort of out there, so it sort of makes sense that all of these sorcerers aren't using it. It's sort of like, hey, there's really power in numbers here at the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel, right? As we cut downstairs where we see a bunch of these sorcerers like, hey, they're on the rooftop, and like, hey, let's go ahead and get going. As we see that they all start to like charge upstairs, and we see tons and tons of sorcerers all heading towards the top floor, where we see Moku sort of having to look down, looking at all of them, as Moku even thinks like, hey, but their sheer numbers are another matter, right? We then cut over to where Ro is fighting with Kogiri, and Ro's like, hey, I can't believe you're recruiting small-time thugs now. Like, hey, you guys must be pretty hard up in all of this sort of times, right? And Kogiri's just like, hey, well, you're going to have your hands full, and every person in the hotel is on their way here. As we see a bunch of these sorcerers are just going like, hey, get her, Samura's daughter. And we see that Iori goes over and is like very scared in the moment. And you see that Sumi sort of moves in front of her, just saying like, hey, it's okay. Like we said, they won't lay a finger on you. And we pretty much see that Iori is just very, very concerned in this moment. She just thinks like, hey, if I stay, these people keep risking their lives for me. And she's like, hey, it's all because of me. If I'm here, people are going to get hurt. And she just remembers a bunch of these moments that we've seen so far. Kogiri walking into the school, killing the teacher outside. Kogiri busting into the school window, traumatizing all of her students. All of the graffiti on her family's home that was just saying like, die to Samura and all of that various stuff. As we just see Iori's just like, hey, in both realities, I think everyone's better off without me. As we then cut scenes massively, as we get the title of this chapter, chapter number 69, The Guy with the Scar. As we cut back into Iori's classroom after Iori had been taken away and after Kogiri left to go chase after her, and Chihiro was stuck in the classroom before Moku and Ro came down to be like, hey, we're heading out of here, right? As you see that Ikura is laying on the ground, and he's like, hey, my name is Ikura. Like, hey, I've known Iori for like just a few months, but like, hey, she's my friend. Can you tell me what's happening to her? As we see that Ikura's hand is very bloodied and very messed up in this instant. As Chihiro, who's of course like standing there in front of Ikura, just is like, hey, there's a dangerous gang going after her, and we're here to protect her. We will ensure her safety. You stay put unless you want to lose more blood. As we sort of just get like a massive zoom in of Ikura's bloodied hand in this moment. As Chihiro goes and like jumps out the window to start chasing after all of this various battle stuff, right? As we see Ikura start to think about all of this, just is like, yeah, right, like, I'm not a guy who's gonna back down that easy. Like, usually I stay out of this part of Kyoto because it's really sketchy, but there's a gang after Iori, so I figured this was the spot to go. And we pretty much see that Ikura has gone to this more shady, like, sorcerer area of Kyoto, definitely a place that he should not be going. And we see that Ikura just goes through and is like, hey, after searching all night, I finally saw them. As we see that Ikura sort of spots Toto out of the various crowd here, and he's just thinking like, whoa, like seriously, bingo, like she was one of the people who went to school. Like if I follow her, I should be able to find Iori, right? And he's like, hey, I better keep my distance. As we see that, of course, he has made it to his way to the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel, where we see that Toto is, of course, sitting down inside of there. And we see that Ikura has also sort of taken a seat on one of these things, right? And we see that he is scared shitless after seeing the battle between Hirohiko and General Manager Yojiro Sengoku, right? And he just thinks like, man, like, I entered this really suspicious hotel and I suddenly was in the middle of, like, a massive bloodbath. And he's like, yeah, in the distance, I heard, like, faint snatches of conversation, like, reinforcements capture alive upstairs, daughter Iori, as he just thinks, like, okay, that means Iori's here. Iori's in this hotel, and, like, they're heading upstairs to where Iori is. And we see that Ikura is getting ready to try to make a move to head upstairs, but he sort of looks around, and he sees the blood everywhere. He sees the devastation that Hirohiko has ended up racking in pretty much, and he's just scared witless pretty much. He is just like panting, and he's like, like what am I gonna do? As we eventually see that he starts to sort of look around at the general scenario, and he just thinks to Chihiro's words, like, hey, if you don't want to shed more blood, then stay put. As we also see that Ikura's hand is very much wrapped up, and like he's sort of got like a small time bandage on his hand from where all of the various injuries were happening, right? As we sort of see the flashback of him getting this bandage put on from the school teacher pretty much, right? As we see that pretty much like the school nurse or whatever just is like, hey, I heard another student say that the attackers were looking for someone. If they were after Iori, she must be hiding something. Like, hey, this seems extremely dangerous. We best leave this to the various authorities. It's better to stay out of it. As we see that this school nurse is going over, or this school medic, whatever you want to call him, is going around and wrapping up Ikura's hand. As we see that Ikura just looks at this bandage and just thinks like, okay, I got told to stay out of it. As we cut to another flashback to the beginning of the school year, as we see Iori standing around with a bunch of her various friends, and we see that her friends are all gossiping to her like, oh, ew, I just feel so bad for Iori, like, you're sitting next to Ikura, and her friend's like, hey, I don't even talk to him, like, he's so cringy, and the way he talks is, like, so ick, and, like, hey, he'll spit all over you, right? As we see that Iori sort of just is like, oh, as we see that Ikura is sitting at his desk, just like, hey, I hope you girls know, like, I can clearly hear all of you, like, fine, say whatever you want to, say whatever you will, but, like, I don't care. Like, I choose solitude. As we see that Iori walks over to Ikura's desk and says, like, hey, my name is Iori. It looks like we're going to be neighbors, so I hope we can be friends. And I love Ikura's reaction, just like, what? As we see that he starts to think in his mind, like, hey, the standard doctrine for this in school is to literally just ignore me, but she totally just worded that. Like, I'm honestly weirdly impressed in a way, right? As we sort of get more narration from him just going like, hey, I abandoned solitude. We see he's like, oh, hey, I'm Ikura, like, nice to meet you, right? And in this moment, we see that Ikura is still looking at his hand and the bandage around it, as eventually he just thinks like, hey, you happen to be a person who doesn't discriminate. Talking with me was just totally basic for you, but for me, it was special. As we see that Ikura clenches his fist in this moment. Of course, it is his left hand, and he just, like, clenches that fist down. And, of course, all of the wounds start to reopen as we see blood just pools up in Ikura's palm. As we remember when we were first introduced to Ikura, and what was that, chapter number 61, if I'm not mistaken, where he was just like, hey, it's proof of my mission, and he had the Chihiro scar drawn in, and, like, some permanent marker on his face. We see that he ends up going down, putting some of his fingers in some of that blood from his palm, and he draws Chihiro's scar straight on his face. It is at this moment when the elevator shaft bursts open and Chihiro and Hirohiko end up on the first floor, as Chihiro's like, hey, I will kill you and I will end up getting to the roof. And we see in this moment that Ikura has run over to this situation. Of course, there is the other guy who was the guy who's like, hey, I don't like how all geniuses actually exist. The disciple of Yojiro Sengoku also laying on the ground. And Ikura sort of runs over and sort of like appears in the scene with these other three various characters and all of this stuff's going on, right? And Chihiro's like, oh, hey, you're that guy from the school. Like, what are you doing here, right? And here Hiko's like, hey, you better not get in the way. Like, this was just getting ready to get good, okay? And we see Ikura just is like, hey, I came to save Iori. And Chihiro's like, hey, I told you it's dangerous. And Ikura's like, hey, I'm fine with getting covered in scars. That is why I'm here. As we see the massive bloody scar that he has on his face that he sort of drew on. And here Hiko's just like, oh, who's this moron, right? As here Hiko goes and starts to go to attack Ikura, but Chihiro jumps in the way and sort of parries the blade as he looks back to Ikura and tosses him the lantern key. Ikura catches it in his palms and is like, hey, what's... And Chihiro says like, hey, this is my response to your pledge. It's the key to bringing Iori back to your regular school life. Take it to the roof and give it to the kid in sunglasses. Which is really funny that even he is still calling Ro a kid in this moment. Like, hey, the kid in sunglasses, go take it to him. He'll get it all taken care of for you, right? And in a court of silence, Chihiro just starts thinking like, hey, right now Iori is uncertain of who she should be. And if someone can take her by the hand and lead her, it should be him. As Chihiro's like, hey, go. And we see that Ikura goes and gets in an elevator and just is like, okay, sounds good. And we see that Ikura goes all the way upstairs and to the roof of the building pretty much with the key in his hand. And we see that Iori is just sort of like in her mind just like, hey, I don't belong anywhere. Sort of like going through this massive various thing. As all of a sudden, she hears her name shouted in the distance. As we just hear like, hey, Iori! As we see that Iori looks up and sees Ikura running straight towards her. And we see that as Ikura is sort of running towards her, he goes out and he grabs the key in his hand and is like, hey, I need you at school! And goes and starts to toss the key over towards Iori and Ro. And we just see that Iori's just thinking like, hey, I really don't know who to be. As we just get a little bit of narration saying like, hey, an ordinary person's scream led her to the answer. As we see that Iori's just like, as we see that Kogi's also like, oh, what is this? Some reinforcements? And we see that Ro's like, oh, why does this pipsqueak have the key? And he's like, uh-oh. And we sort of see that all of these regular sorcerers go to start attacking Ikura in the moment. And we just get a little bit of narration saying like, hey, desire to protect that ordinary life. And bizarrely enough, that feeling, as we see a bunch of scenes happening. We see Iori sort of coming here in this moment and jump away from behind Sumi wherever she is. We see that Iori runs up and grabs a sword out of the hands of one of these various sorcerers. And we see that Ikura is sort of bracing himself and like very scared of what's about to happen. As we see that running up right in front of Ikura is none other than Iori. As we see the image of the lock finally breaking into a million different pieces. As we see standing in front of Ikura in this moment is none other than Iori, eyes closed, holding the blade in one hand and the sheath in the other, parrying a sword strike. As we finish the narration, and bizarrely enough, that feeling caused her to awaken as Seichi Samura's daughter. And that is where we end chapter number 69 of Kagurabachi on this really awesome note of, hey, Iori has now awoken and has found her power of the sword. And man, what a really awesome moment to end off this chapter on. Now, I know a lot of people weren't the happiest with this chapter in terms of like, I've seen a lot of discourse online where people are constantly comparing Iori to, I think her name was Ritsu or something like that, the character from the Hidden Inventory arc of Jujutsu Kaisen, where she pretty much ended up just getting murdered by Toji and all of that various stuff. And there's a lot of discourse online that Iori was not going to be surviving this arc. Now, for a second, I never believed that Iori was not going to be surviving this arc. I knew that Iori was going to become one of the main cast members in any way. Honestly, I was figuring that it would have been more of a situation where like Iori would have been wanted to stay in her regular life, so she would have ended up asking Chihiro to be also trained, and that would eventually lead to some conflict with Samura and all of that other various stuff. So I was not exactly expecting Kagurabachi to sort of progress in the way it has, where Iori has sort of like remembered all of this various stuff and like is now getting ready to wield her sword. There's also been a lot of talk online about the panel where we saw the white EI purity style, and we saw it was right next to a tree and all of the various members of it. And we saw on that tree there were these special types of like 5-pointed leaves pretty much. And whenever Iori was first mentioned in chapter number 60, we also saw one of these leaves in the distance falling down. I guess sort of showing some symbolism that, like, hey, this is either like the Seichi Samura sort of various thing of like, hey, this is like the family tree or whatever, or it's more of like, hey, this was a direct relation, like, hey, Iori knows what she's getting ready to do, and she had these sword skills. Another thing that people have been bringing up is, like, whenever we saw Chihiro go over to Samura's residence, Samura had those straw pylons just, like, sitting out and ready as, like, sword training devices. And why would Samura need to use those when he's already a massive sorcerer? Now, besides of the obvious thing of, like, hey, Samura may just want to train, he could also have been training Iori that entire time, who was also probably living at the house. So, while a lot of people were not the very much happiest with Iori having all of these sword powers, I also think that it is very, very cool in this moment. Now, as far for the rest of the chapter, I did not mention it in the review because I sort of just wanted to keep on, like, the very awesome moment of, like, Ikura running up, tossing Iori to key and all that various stuff. But whenever we see Ikura in this panel on page number 17, by this point, he has already drawn on Chihiro's scar, but we see that Ikura does not have the scar drawn on his face in this moment. I don't know if that's just something that Takeru Hokuzono accidentally forgot to draw on Ikura's face in this moment, or if he sort of just wanted to show Ikura being strong as he normally is, but all of the other scenes that we see of Ikura in this chapter have the bloody Chihiro scar on the side of his face, right? I honestly think that we should be giving a name to this scar, like, hey, the Scar of Salvation or something pretty cool like that, but either way, this was a really awesome chapter of Kagurabachi. I also like how Chihiro sort of realizes that he's not the one who can help Iori make this decision, and really the only person who can is Ikura, by tossing Ikura that key and just saying, like, hey, it's pretty much up to you now. It's a really cool moment there, and really, I was not expecting to ever see Ikura again. I was expecting that he was going to be a one-off character in Iori's school, and honestly, I would be really, really happy if Ikura also appeared and started to become more of Chihiro's group also, like, I know it's something that happens with every manga. Like, right now, Chihiro's group is really Chihiro himself. We have Shiba, of course. We have Char and Hinao, along with Tafuku and Hiyuki. But with that, I would also love if... Oh, and of course, how could I forget Hakuri in that moment, too? But we have the... How many characters that? We have Chihiro, we have Hinao, we have Char, we have Shiba, Hakuri. So we have 7 main characters in the various, like, hey, this is Chihiro's group. And honestly, I would really love if we get Ikura and Iori added on to do that as well. I guess we also have the boss me too, but, like, all of that is besides the point. But also, seeing how this character sort of evolved and how Ikura started moving, I really want to see the guy who was so depressed last chapter, like, I don't know how I'm going to be able to, like, geniuses are too big. I really hope that guy appears again, because if Takeru Hokuzono is showing us that he can bring back these characters and, like, let them rest for a little while, like, hey, we know that Hakuri is still just sort of sitting there and, like, his brain is still a little messed up and he's still trying to heal from all of that. We really don't know what's going on with Tafuku and Hiyuki, but, like, and same with, like, Hinao and Shiba and all of those various characters. So this is just pretty cool to see, like, hey, how all of this various stuff is sort of going on and wrapping together, and I hope we see more of these characters in the future. But either way, a really awesome moment between Ikura and Iori this week, and I really just can't wait to see what happens next time in chapter number 70 of Kagurabachi. So, pretty good chapter for sure. Yeah, and with all of that out of the way, thank you guys so very much for watching this video on Kagurabachi chapter number 69. Nice. If you want to watch some other Kagurabachi videos, I've got plenty of them on the channel. I think I uploaded the chapter number 68 review actually earlier today at the filming of this video. So I think I've got like 26 Kagurabachi videos is how many it said was in the playlist. So if you want to hear my thoughts on the previous 26 Kagurabachi chapters, well, go check out that playlist, and all of this stuff is pretty much on there, so go check out all of those. It will be linked on the description box of this video, along as on the end card of this video. And if you want to hear more anime and manga related content, well, you are in the perfect place, because I do plenty of it. So also just go down and check out my channel and all of that various stuff there. And yeah, I really don't have too much else to say about this chapter. Oh, also, if you guys want to be in the Glowplasma Discord community, I would love to have talks about Kagurabachi on there if any of you guys are ever up to it. So join that server. It's down also in the description down below. And really, with all that being said, thank you guys very much for watching this Kagurabachi chapter review. Again, this was chapter number 69, titled The Guy with the Scar. Of course, Chihiro, but also Ikura in this moment. It's just a really nice thing. And I will catch you guys next time for Kagurabachi chapter number 70. Again, thank you guys so very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. This will be Glowplasma 231, signing out. Again, thanks for watching, Botch Bros. See ya.